and Islam is perfectly compatible with Western liberalism, then it's all going to be fine. But if they're wrong, our society...
Douglas Murray walks into a room where most people already disagree with him. The motion is simple. Islam is a religion of peace. He has just 10 minutes to argue against it. Instead of relying on slogans, Murray goes straight to the Quran, the Hadith, and polling data from British Muslims. Charlie Hebdo enters the discussion. So does a striking admission from Mehdi Hassan. Then someone in the room interrupts him, and that's where things really get interesting. Watch how Murray responds. Let's get into it.
What is Islam? What is Islam? We've had a lot of talk already tonight about it, and I've only got 10 minutes, so I'm very unlikely to be able to give you a comprehensive definition. If you listen to Zach, Muhammad, who founded Islam, was a sort of prototype of a just especially benevolent town councillor in the region of Fife. If you listened to him, you would get the impression that it was a pure arrangement of a few minimal issues of governance and so on. Now that isn't the case. Islam is many, many things. It's many complex things. It's not easy to sum it up. It is a religion, however, and it is possible to sum it up to some extent. My own favorite definition is that there are, in essence, three Islams. There is the Islam of the origins, that is the texts, the Quran and the Hadith, the sayings, and indeed the early lives of Muhammad. There is the second Islam, the way in which that has been extrapolated out over the centuries in the body of law known as the Sharia. And there is a third Islam that we often mean when we talk about Islam, which is what do Muslims believe? How do Muslims live? Now, these are very, very deep waters, but there isn't any point in seeing deep waters unless you plunge straight in. Zach said in his comments that we must return to Islam's religious values. But the problem is that Zach's version of Islam's religious values is going to be very different from a lot of other people's. And let me put this point to you at its hardest, but I think it's necessary and it's truthful. Groups like ISIS have the worst possible interpretation of Islam. It should go without saying. But they have the worst possible interpretation of Islam for Muslims and for non-Muslims. However, it is an interpretation of the texts that they have. It is a valid interpretation of the lessons they take from the life of Muhammad. It is a possible interpretation of the texts and traditions they have in front of them.
Murray has only 10 minutes, and he wastes none of them. He breaks Islam into three parts: the original text, the Sharia built around them, and the way Muslims actually practice the religion today. The other side presents a softer, more comforting version of Muhammad. Murray goes straight back to the Quran and the Hadith. Then he lands the point the room clearly doesn't want to confront. ISIS may represent an extreme interpretation, but it draws from the same religious sources as everyone else. Murray's argument is not that ISIS represents all Muslims, it's that the interpretation exists within the same textual tradition. And that is the challenge he puts in front of the other side. Watch how they respond.
I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, that Muhammad was not Buddha. He did not live his life as Buddha. The world would be a lot more peaceable if he did, but it wasn't the case. I know that Shabir said in his comments that he doesn't want us to get into comparisons with other religions, but it might just be necessary. Consider the history of Islam, of Christianity, ladies and gentlemen. The history of Christianity, goodness knows, has been bloody. Would it have been more bloody or less bloody if on even one occasion, when one of Jesus' disciples comes to him and says, how many times should I forgive my brother? 7 times or 70 times 7. If instead of saying forgive him endlessly, which is what Jesus ends up saying, he'd have said chop off his head. What would have happened to the history of Christianity if even on one occasion when a woman is brought to Jesus found in adultery, instead of saying he who is without sin casts the first stone, said stone her? I think we can all agree, we should all be able to agree, in a place like this, the history of Christianity would have been bloodier. So it is with Islam. And I know that in a house like this, in this particular era, it's necessary to pretend that some people believe in Christianity, some people believe in Islam, some people do yoga, and that there isn't very much difference between them. There is, ladies and gentlemen. The origins matter. And I've got a lot to get through. in a situation like the one we have with Islam, where we're forever told, and with some legitimacy, that there are no authorities in Islam, or there are no pope-like authorities and so on, there is something in this. If that is the case, then those origins matter even more. You can all go home tonight and not only watch YouTube, but read a Quran, read the Hadith, read the early lives of Muhammad, and you can see it for yourselves. Now that is a conversation we should be able to have, and we should be having. And there should not be this denialism. There should not be this pretense that the texts and the origins and the life of Muhammad are not a problem. They're a huge problem, ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you.
Look at the move Murray just made with Christianity. He never pretends its history was peaceful or spotless. In fact, he openly admits it was bloody too. Then he asks the question most people avoid. What would Christianity have looked like if Jesus had told his followers to kill their enemies or stone sinners instead of preaching forgiveness? That is Murray's point. The origins of a religion matter because the words and actions attributed to its founder shape how later generations interpret the faith. And judging by the reaction in the room, that argument clearly hit a nerve.
Another person who assumes that this side has done no reading. I would like to turn to something else that the other side came up with, which was something else that Zach said. Zach said Islam is not the actions of Muslims. If it's not the texts, and it's not the traditions, and it's not the actions of Muslims, then it's going to be very hard to work out what Islam is. But let me tell you some facts that should interest this House about what Muslims think. And I'm not going to go to Saudi Arabia. I don't need to go to Saudi Arabia. I don't need to go to the Gulf States. I don't need to go to Iran. I'll just use the opinions of Muslims in Britain. So here we go. Here's one. It's generally agreed that the modern liberal state includes the right of sexual minorities to live their lives and find love as they wish. A Gallup poll carried out here in the UK in 2009 found that 0% of British Muslims think that homosexuality is acceptable. 0. An ICM poll carried out last year found that 52% of British Muslims think that homosexuality should be made illegal. 52% of British Muslims last year. A YouGov poll from 2015 found that nationwide in Britain, about 16% of the population think that homosexuality is morally wrong, but that raised to 29% in London. Why would that be? I leave you to ponder. Free speech is also, I think, widely agreed, certainly in Professor Borkstein's country, to be an important element in liberalism. So let's consider that one. Channel 4 in 2006, another notorious right-wing conspiracy, Channel 4. Channel 4 in 2006 found that 78% of British Muslims thought that the publishers of the Danish cartoons should be prosecuted.
Murray doesn't need to point to Saudi Arabia or Iran to make his case. He keeps the focus entirely on Britain, using polling of British Muslims. He cites a 2009 Gallup poll showing 0% acceptance of homosexuality, an ICM poll in which 52% supported making it illegal, and a Channel 4 poll showing 78% believed the publishers of the Danish cartoons should be prosecuted. Instead of trading opinions, Murray keeps putting numbers on the table. And now the challenge for the other side is simple. Answer the evidence directly.
A BBC poll in 2015 found that 27% of British Muslims had, quote, some sympathy, end quote, for the people who went into the offices of Charlie Hebdo and killed the cartoonists, editors and journalists there. Channel 4 poll from last year found that only 1% of UK Muslims think that publications should have the right to publish cartoons of Muhammad.
Then Murray turns to Charlie Hebdo. He cites a BBC poll saying 27% of British Muslims expressed some sympathy for the attackers, while another poll found only 1% supported the right to publish cartoons of Muhammad. Those numbers immediately raised the stakes in the room. But instead of answering the polling directly, someone interrupts with a story from the Hadith. And Murray is about to turn that story right back on them.
Your point is that Muslims, are getting offended. I actually agree with what you're saying. I think it's totally unacceptable that Muslims do that. But do you know that there's a story of the Hadith of a woman who used to pour rubbish on Muhammad every time he preached, and Muhammad wouldn't complain. And when one day the woman wasn't there, he went to her house to see if she was okay. She was ill. You know, do you see how far the Muslims of today are going from the original?
Then the moderator steps in with a story from the Hadith. A woman repeatedly throws rubbish at Muhammad, and when she falls ill, he goes to check on her. But that doesn't directly answer Murray's polling. He was asking what British Muslims believe today, while the response shifts to a centuries-old anecdote about Muhammad's behavior. And there's an important concession inside the interruption itself. The moderator agrees that taking offense in this way is unacceptable. Murray immediately picks up on that and turns the story back toward his original point.
Nobody doubts that Muhammad did home visits. Nobody can also doubt that he ordered some of his critics to be killed. So you've got to weigh those two up, haven't you? So the subject of women's come up already tonight, but I'll just give you one figure. A poll carried out last year, also by Channel 4, found that nationwide 5% of the British population agree with the phrase that wives should, quote, always obey their husbands. 5% across the country. However, 39% of British Muslims agree with that phrase. Give me one other quick example. This isn't a figure. This is a quote from an eminent opponent of mine called Mehdi Hasan, a British Muslim journalist. Mehdi Hasan, on the subject of anti-Semitism within Britain's Muslim communities, wrote the following in 2013. It pains me to have to admit this, but anti-Semitism isn't just tolerated in some sections of the British Muslim community, it is routine and commonplace. Any Muslims reading this article will know what I'm referring to. It is, he said, quote, our dirty little secret. Now, there was a gentleman there who's come armed with a whole set of inaccurate facts, which he's obviously gleaned from a quick Google. But not only were they wrong, but also I think that the underlying point he was trying to make also is wrong. It does matter, and it's going to matter a lot in the years ahead, what people in this country think. If, as I said, in your most diverse and plural areas, they are more likely, for instance, to be intolerant towards sexual and other minorities, then you're going to have a problem, aren't you? At some point, as that community grows with these intolerant attitudes, the problem is, of course, going to grow, unless you admit to it, unless you face up to it, unless you're willing to do the self-criticism that Tariq Ramadan quite rightly says that we should all be participating in. It's clear from the figures I gave, from all sorts of stories, you can open any day's newspaper, that in terms of social liberalism and in terms of political liberalism, Islam is simply the slowest kid in the class. We are all in our societies now having to move at the speed of this slowest kid in the class. It's why we're having the argument in 21st century Britain about what a woman's rights should be in a court, including a Sharia court in the UK. And it doesn't help that we have this denialism about what we can all see and read, what we can all read if we read the histories of Islam and also read about the founder of Islam, what he taught, what he claimed, and what he did. I don't deny that there are times when Muhammad did very nice things, but we also have to face up to the times when he wasn't like Buddha, when he wasn't just a home carer and a caregiver, and when he was a warrior and a warlord and killed prisoners who he captured in conflict. These are very important things to focus on as well as the caregiver bits. You see, the thing is, ladies and gentlemen, is perhaps this will all work out. Perhaps we just have to wait. Perhaps we just allow Islam to catch up and allow all the Muslims of the world to catch up, and at some point the gays should be patient, and the women should be patient, and the Jews should be patient, and everybody else should be patient, and anyone who cares about free speech should just be patient. Perhaps it'll all work out, and perhaps it won't. Perhaps it won't work out at all. Maybe it'll all go in another direction entirely. And you see, that is the big problem of this debate tonight. Because if the other side tonight is right, and Islam is perfectly compatible with Western liberalism, then it's all going to be fine. But if they're wrong, our society is screwed. We are taking part in an article of blind faith and putting our future in the hands of a combustible religion that denies what is at its roots, even whilst pretending it has other things going on. That is, I would argue, the worst possible situation for a liberal society to be in. So I know why tonight you will feel, and rightly feel, that it would be good to walk through this side of the house, to say that Islam is perfectly compatible with Western liberalism and to take part in that pretense. But I would argue that you should go through this side or down the middle, because this whole thing is up for grabs. It could all yet go very much worse than it's already gone.
Murray doesn't predict a catastrophe here. He does something much harder. He points at the polls he just read out. Listen to the patients list. Gay people, women, Jews, anyone who wants to publish freely. All of them told to wait. Then comes the line of the night. If they're wrong,
Murray isn't predicting some inevitable catastrophe. He does something more effective. He points back to the polling he has already laid out. Then he names the people being asked to wait: gay people, women, Jews, and anyone who cares about free expression. And that leads to the line that defines his argument. If the other side is wrong about Islam's compatibility with Western liberalism, the consequences could be enormous. That is the contrast Murray wants the room to confront. Hard polling about attitudes today versus a comforting story about a home visit centuries ago. And you can feel the argument land.
And the one thing that we can say with certainty is that if we avoid all the difficult parts of this argument and fall for the kumbaya version of Islam rather than looking at it ourselves, then the future of Islam, of Muslims, of British Muslims, European Muslims, and of those of us who are not Muslim is going to go very badly wrong indeed in the years ahead. So thank you.
This is sort of unconventional, but the lady there had her hand up for the full 10 minutes of the last speech. So if you would like to make a point, just for sheer dedication, please go ahead. Name and college as well, please.
For my dedication, can I just ask 2 questions, please? Yeah. So the first question I wanted to ask is, to what extent do you distinguish between how a term can be defined and the worst form of interpretation? So, for example, if I say, and I admire the fact that I support a secular state, does that mean I should advocate the worst interpretation of secularism, such as becoming supporting Soviet Union? Second question I want to ask is, to what extent would you distinguish, as you rightly say, the British Muslims being very anti-homosexual, as being following tribal cultures from South Asia, or because we know that that type of idea of killing homosexuality, being anti-homosexual, is not just restricted to Muslims in South Asia, but also Hindus in South Asia, Sikhs in South Asia, and Christians in African countries. Thank you.
She comes back with 2 questions, and both challenge Murray from a different angle. First, she uses the Soviet Union analogy. Supporting secularism doesn't mean supporting Stalinism. Fair point, but Murray's argument was never that ISIS represents the only interpretation of Islam. His point was that it is one interpretation drawn from the same religious tradition. Then she shifts to culture, arguing that anti-gay attitudes also exist among Hindus, Sikhs, and Christians in other parts of the world. Now watch how Murray responds, because instead of accepting that as an explanation, he argues that it avoids the question he has been raising all night. What role do the religious texts themselves actually play?
Well, it's a very good question. I'm sorry I had so much to get through that I had to leave you with a numb arm, but thank you for persevering. On the first of those things, no, I think that actually what the other side, by the way, did this evening was actually to essentialize Western culture. We hear a lot about the essentializing of Islam, very little about the essentializing of our culture. Immediately, Tariq Ramadan and others go on to colonialism and so on. It's as if the history of countries like ours is only one of colonialism. It's as if the rest of what we've achieved is as nothing. As for your second question, this is another way to evade it. I don't know any Jew or Christian who doesn't deny chapters in Leviticus, okay? But I find it very, very commonplace, as we had this evening, that people ignore that the hadith, the sayings of Muhammad, are pretty strong on the matter of what you do about the gays. So if we were to arrive at some kind of process of moving beyond that, you would have to start, wouldn't you, by saying, well, the authoritative books and collections of Bukhari hadith of Muhammad are not gay liberation documents. any more than their women's liberation documents. You would start by admitting that, but we always go around the other way. We always go, no, it's a specific, it's a cultural thing. It's not to do with religion, it's to do with a particular tribal thing. Often then, it's, as we hear quite often about this, it's the British and other colonial powers imported homophobia to the Muslim world, which otherwise was just great with us gays. And this also is not an accurate interpretation. So, as I say, I would urge that Muslims in debating subjects like this admit what's in the texts and get beyond them fast. But I'm not a Muslim. They have to do the job themselves. I just hope they do.
10 minutes, and Murray never loses his footing. His argument was never that Muslims themselves are the problem. His focus was on the texts and on whether people are willing to confront what those texts actually say. Again and again, the debate moves somewhere else. A story about rubbish instead of the polling, tribal culture instead of Bukhari, colonialism instead of the hadith, and the broader question of religious interpretation. That is the pattern Murray keeps pointing to. Whenever the discussion gets uncomfortable, the focus shifts away from the source material. His challenge is simple. Read the text, examine the evidence, and argue from there. So, where do you land? Did Murray raise a serious point that the other side failed to answer, or were their objections stronger than he gave them credit for?